So the first thing that we want to look at in this course really is awareness, building awareness around anxiety. We don't want to spend too much time doing this. To be honest, what we're looking at really is to think about becoming a confident performer. So rather than constantly worrying about the actual anxiety and all the details around it, what we're really looking at is aiming for the future of how you want to be as a performer. But it is useful, I think, to just get a kind of flavour of what's going on in terms of your experience with anxiety, because what we want to do, as I say, is we are shining a light on anxiety as much as possible and actually kind of partnering up with it. And in that case, rather than kind of like trying to forget or ignore it, what we're going to do is to actually allow it to sort of be what it is and get some understanding of it. So fundamentally, we are becoming an anxiety detective. Okay, that is a magnifying glass, just in case you're curious. And I would suggest that you have some form of journal for this course, so you can write answers down, whether it's an online notebook or some piece of paper, but just to get some of these things down so it's not just kind of floating around in your memory. Now, what I'm going to do in this particular one is ask a series of questions, and I'll talk a little bit about my experience, but what you want to do is to think about what is your experience here. So first of all, where do you tend to experience anxiety? And here what I'm talking about are physical locations, because this is an interesting phenomena. Do you tend to get anxiety more in smaller, kind of more intimate settings, or do you tend to get anxiety as a musician in much larger settings? Now, just for me, I used to find the smaller settings were the problems. So, for example, where I performed in a chapel as a teacher, I used to find that I got most nervous there, where there was a very small group of people kind of surrounding and watching very, very quietly. In a pub where there's loads of stuff going on, just playing in a function band, there were no nerves at all. And I even played a double bass solo in front of about 1,000 people in a stadium, and I didn't really get nervous there because it was so impersonal to me that I didn't find any sense of kind of relationship to anxiety. But if you've got a group of about 20 musicians watching carefully in a very small space, suddenly that was when my nerves kicked in. Now, for some of you, that might be the complete opposite experience. But what you want to think about is, where do you get most anxious at the moment? And are there places where you don't get anxious? The question you want to then ask is, why do you think that is? And the second interesting one to ask would be, do you get more nervous in front of family and friends or strangers? Again, I used to get more nervous in front of friends and family because there was something about the link with them and wanting to make sure that they kind of knew I was a good musician that seemed to cause problems, whereas for me in front of strangers it really wasn't an issue at all. But again, have a think about what makes you most nervous. It may be that all of them do, but it's quite interesting to think about which areas make you more nervous, because this starts giving you clues as to what it is that's actually triggering the anxiety. The next question is, how do you experience the anxiety itself? Now again, this is quite a big question, but physiologically, where do you tend to experience it? So for me and a lot of people, it's usually in the stomach, okay? But some people experience anxiety as a kind of this flood, and technically really it's just adrenaline, in their chest, okay? Some people experience it in their throat. Some people become very aware of it actually in their hands, and for me, hands were terrible. At the height of my anxiety, even as a one-to-one teacher, my hands used to shake almost uncontrollably when I tried to demonstrate things, and that's how bad it got at one point. But some people get really worried about their feet or their legs shaking. So where do you actually experience the anxiety? Is there a particular part of your body that it actually tends to hit? Again, one of the things we'll look at is then actually experiencing it fully and getting used to just allowing it to sit when you feel anxious, instead of trying to shove it away with a technique, to actually feel the sensation in your body where it is and actually just sit with it. This is a really, really important thing. And it's becoming very popular with the ideas of surrounding things like mindfulness and kind of breathing exercises and becoming self-aware of emotions and not trying to fight them off, but actually learn about them. Next one, key phrases. Are there any key phrases that you say to yourself? This is going to become really important when we look at the psychology unit, because often you'll find that subconsciously or even consciously you keep repeating phrases as you're about to go on. I can't handle this, this is going to go wrong, what if, and all these kind of things. And if you can actually locate certain phrases, they may not be the same every single time you say it, but a kind of internal dialogue and a kind of way that you keep saying something about yourself, this is really important to write down, and I'll show you how to actually then reconstruct your way of thinking around these terms later on. Again, you might not find any, but some people are quickly aware that they are saying the same kind of dialogue each time they perform. The next thing we could look at is when you become anxious, if you're someone that suffers from musical performance anxiety, was this as a result of one particular experience that triggered all of this, or is this something that gradually came on cumulatively? So for me, for example, I was brought up in a very musical family, and I took up the violin when I was quite young. I was in church choirs and orchestras. I used to get nervous singing in choirs when I was younger, but not really anything bad. Then I found jazz, and then everything kind of took off, and I put down the violin and put it under the bed and took up the banjo and then the guitar and a bass and then a piano, and I absolutely loved jazz. And I came to study art, but actually then went on to a music degree instead. And you couldn't really pull me away from performing. If there was a piano anywhere, I would be right up there performing all the way through college when I was studying, and I loved it. Partly because I didn't really care about it at the time. It was just a really fun hobby that I'd got into. But when I became a teacher, and there was something where I felt like I had to kind of prove my worth, the performances started getting more pressured, and there was one particular performance that I dealt with where everything literally came crumbling down, and from that point on, every single time I went to perform, the memory of that one, which had kind of locked itself in my brain, just kept repeating itself over and over again, and it became a really vicious circle. And people just going, oh, just get on with it, just go and perform, you'll get over it, was really very unhelpful advice, because it didn't. It just got worse and worse and worse. It was a completely different thing that I had to do. But it's quite interesting again to look at, was there a particular experience that's triggered this, or was it a kind of gradual build-up of anxiety? Again, you might not remember this, and if you don't, it doesn't matter, but if you can answer the question, it's useful to kind of track what's happened. The next thing is, why do you actually think you get anxious? What is it that you are anxious about? Now, a lot of people, it's a fear of being judged. So when they're actually performing, that other people are kind of criticising them or thinking they're not very good. There is what we call the kind of pretender syndrome, where you don't feel that you're actually good enough to be doing this. There's all sorts of different ways. But what is the key thing that you're most anxious about? Again, we're going to look at that partly when we look at the blueprint and what we call the rules that you have probably as a performer that you may have subconsciously kind of constructed for yourself. But one thing that's interesting to do, and only if you feel comfortable, is what is the actual worst case scenario for you as a performer? Now, this is not a kind of new bit of psychology. Stoicism, which was a kind of ancient Greek philosophy, actually had something called the premeditatio majorum, which is basically to actually think about the worst case scenario and then work off that. Now, this for some people is a very, very useful thing to do, to think about what is the worst thing that you can picture. For some people, it's just having a complete mental blank about what they're actually doing, forgetting the words, completely freezing. For other people, it's playing something not perfectly. So actually not just making a single mistake is a kind of worst case scenario for them. For other people, it would be that half the audience don't applaud and half of them do. And for other people, their worst case scenario is, it could be an incredibly sort of vague one, which doesn't actually affect them at all. So it's quite interesting to think about what is the worst case scenario for you as a performer. Finally, I want to look at this, which is, how do you experience anxiety in terms of what we call a metaphor? So what is it like for you? Now, for some people, they would talk about being kind of like frozen in the headlights. Some people, it feels like it's kind of being under a cloud. For some people, it's like being stuck in mud. So there is this kind of metaphorical language if you actually explore it in your imagination. What is it like to be anxious? Now, for some people, again, nothing really comes up. But for other people, it genuinely feels like a very, very strong image in their head of what anxiety is, like being up against a wall, for example, all of these different kind of metaphorical sort of images. So have a think about what it's like. Now again, we don't want to dwell too much about this, but what is interesting, I think, is rather than kind of like avoiding it, is to just start thinking a little bit about the anxiety experience and your relation to it. The final one I want to talk about, which is really important, is this. Where do you get most nervous in the actual time frame of anxiety and performance? Now, we have something called the anxiety cycle here, the kind of time cycle of anxiety. So we have pre-performance up here, and that can be anything from 6 months before a performance, to a month before a performance, to a week before a performance, to the evening before the performance, to literally 10 seconds before you're about to play, to the nanosecond before you go to sing or put your bow up on the string. All of that is pre-performance, okay? Most people, statistically, find the bit where they're just about to go on is the point where they usually get most nervous, but there are people that have different experiences with this. Then there is the actual performance itself, where you're actually in the act of playing. And for some people, they can be fairly confident as they go on and actually start playing, and then the nerves hit them mid-performance. So suddenly the kind of adrenaline kicks in at that point. So this is an interesting phenomenon as well. Not everyone is a kind of pre-performance. Some people it's the actual performance, whereas some people can get incredibly nervous as they're actually building up to the performance, but as they go to play, they are able to go back into their kind of confidence and trust. The final one, although it's not so much to do with anxiety, is post-performance, where people will often come off from their performance and then start picking themselves apart, saying, well, that went wrong, and often focusing entirely on the kind of negative aspects of their performance. This then relates back to the next performance, which will be coloured by whatever happened within this particular time cycle. So have a think about, where do you tend to affect yourself most? For some people it's the whole lot, but for some people it might be pre-performance, and there are particular techniques that are specific to that time frame. For some people, during the actual performance, that's when they need to actually concentrate on how they're going to deal with this. And again, we'll talk about that when we talk about the flow state or the zone. And post-performance is another one. And again, we're going to look at that when we look at inner and outer criticism and how we actually deal with constructive and toxic criticism. So these are all different things to think about when we're looking at anxiety itself.